Hey, hi, welcome back. In the last Q&A video, I said I'm gonna link to a really valuable resource in the description. It's a self-assessment, and then reality happened. So I owe you an apology. It was very neurotypical of me to make it sound so simple, as if there are no obstacles anywhere or opportunities to get derailed or distracted, because I, of all people, should know that there are. So this video is me helping you in a hands-on walkthrough of the World Health Organization self-assessment. So let's get started. Okay, so this self-assessment is called the Adult ADHD Self-Report Scale Symptom Checklist. And this was developed by the World Health Organization, the work group on adult ADHD, and it consists of 18 symptoms, or posed as questions, that are predictive of adult ADHD. And the work group found that the first 6 questions that are listed here, and there's a little gap after them, are the most strongly predictive of adult ADHD. So we're going to go through those first and then take a little break. And then in part B, we'll go through the other 12 symptoms. So if you're not in a situation where you can download the assessment or print it out and work on a hard paper copy, don't worry, I have my copy with the instructions and the questions. Just grab a notebook, any piece of paper, and we'll walk through the questions one at a time, and you can write down your answers. Then we're going to score it, and I like stars. So if you like stars, get out your stars, and you can give yourself a reward for working through it. So you can take that to your doctor so you can figure out the right approach for you to manage your adult ADHD symptoms. So part of the nature of ADHD is that it's inconsistent. Your symptoms will get better or worse sometimes because of things you're doing to help make them better, or accidentally doing that are making them worse. But sometimes they seem to wax and wane all on their own. So this symptom assessment isn't 100% predictive. Like, if you get a score of blank, yes, you definitely have adult ADHD. And if you get a score of blank -1, you definitely don't have it. You've never had it. It's not like that. This is sort of taking your temperature, right? Your body temperature goes up and down all the time. So what this is showing is, do you have a fever? Are these symptoms really bothering you right now? And it asks you to think about what's been happening in the last 6 months. If all of these things that are bothering you are new in the last 6 months, and you never dealt with any of these traits as a child or at any other time in your life, you definitely want to bring that up with your doctor. It probably isn't adult ADHD if you've never experienced these symptoms before the last 6 months. On the other hand, if these things aren't bothering you right now, or not very much, then you may be going through a good period. Take it again 6 months from now and see if anything's changed. So this is more like a thermometer to take your temperature with. It's not a bright line diagnostic test. But it is useful and it may give you some insight. Enough talking. You came for the quiz. Let's get started on the quiz. So the instructions say, please answer these questions rating yourself according to which category best describes how you felt and conducted yourself over the past 6 months. Ready? Question 1. How often do you have trouble wrapping up the final details of a project once the challenging parts have been done? And you're going to scale that as never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. I'll give you a second. Okay, question 2. How often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organization? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 3. How often do you have problems remembering appointments or obligations? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 4. When you have a task that requires a lot of thought, how often do you avoid or delay getting started? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. How often do you fidget or squirm with your hands or feet when you have to sit down for a long time? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 6. How often do you feel overly active and compelled to do things, like you were driven by a motor? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. So yay! You got through the first 6 questions. I know if you're struggling with attention, that was work, and that's why I'm breaking this up and trying to keep it interesting for you. Okay, so stars. Give yourself stars. I like to give myself stars whenever I accomplish something because it makes me happy. And when you're happy, your brain is releasing dopamine, and dopamine is your reward chemical, right? And the reason ADHD medication does anything in your brain is because it makes your brain release dopamine. So, yay! More stars! More stars, more dopamine, more focus, right? Okay, so time for scoring the first 6 questions. The official instructions for the self-assessment say that a score of 4 or more on Part A means that the patient, that you, have symptoms highly consistent with ADHD and further investigation is warranted. Okay, so question number 1 about wrapping up the final details of a project. If you marked sometimes, often, or very often, give yourself 1 point. Question 2 about getting things in order to do a task that requires organization. If you marked sometimes, often, or very often, give yourself 1 point. Question 3 about remembering appointments and obligations. If you marked sometimes, often, or very often, give yourself 1 point. Okay? Question 4 about having a task that requires a lot of thought, avoiding or delaying, procrastinating, starting on it. That's actually a pretty typical thing that a lot of people do. So if you gave yourself an often or very often, give yourself 1 point. If it's only sometimes, no points. And of course, if it's never or rarely, no points. Question 5 about Fidgeting and squirming when you have to sit for a long time. Again, this happens to a lot of people. Sometimes is 0 points. If it's often or very often, give yourself 1 point. Okay? And question 6, about feeling overly active, driven by a motor. Again, that is often or very often. Give yourself 1 point. Okay, so we've scored the first section. If you have 4 or more points out of these 6 questions, congratulations! You have symptoms that are highly consistent with adult ADHD. And if you have 3 or less, congratulations! You probably don't have adult ADHD. But again, it's subjective. It changes over time. So if you got a score of 3 or less on Part A, you don't have to stay and score Part B, do Part B as well. And in the meantime, no matter what your score was, if you're having any issues, go back and look at those 3 best things you can do today to help yourself. If you think you have adult ADHD, it's on the What is Adult ADHD video, and there's a time code so you can jump right to it, because those are going to help anybody with anything going on with brain health, memory, mood. They're just good for you. If you did get a score of 4 or more, let's get started on Section B. And I'm going to get these stickers off because they're starting to itch, and I can't pay attention to anything when I'm itchy. Okay, just a second.
Question 7. How often do you make careless mistakes when you have to work on a boring or difficult project? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 8. How often do you have difficulty keeping your attention when you're doing boring or repetitive work? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 9. How often do you have difficulty concentrating on what people say to you, even when they're speaking to you directly? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 10. How often do you misplace or have difficulty finding things at home or at work? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 11. How often are you distracted by activity or noise around you? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 12. How often do you leave your seat in meetings or other situations in which you are expected to remain seated? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 13. How often do you feel restless or fidgety? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 14. How often do you have difficulty unwinding and relaxing when you have time to yourself? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 15. How often do you find yourself talking too much when you're in social situations? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 16. When you're in a conversation, how often do you find yourself finishing the sentences of the people you're talking to before they can finish them themselves? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 17. How often do you have difficulty waiting your turn in situations where turn-taking is required? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 18. How often do you interrupt others when they're busy? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often.
Okay, so part B, we're going to score that, starting with question 7. Question 7 is about making careless mistakes if you have to work on something boring or complicated. So if you scored often or very often, 1 point. Question 8, is it difficult to keep your attention doing boring or repetitive work? Again, often or very often. Give yourself 1 point. Okay, question 9 is difficulty concentrating on what people are saying to you even when they're talking to you directly. For that one, if you put sometimes, often, or very often, 1 point. Okay, question 10, about misplacing things or having difficulty finding things at home or at work. If you scored often or very often, that's 1 point. Question 11, being distracted by activity or noise around you. That is, if you have often or very often, it's 1 point. Question 12, how often do you leave your seat in meetings or in other situations where you're expected to remain seated? And that is, if you scored sometimes, often, or very often, 1 point. Question 13, restless or fidgety, often or very often is 1 point. Sometimes is no points. Question 14, how often do you have difficulty unwinding and relaxing? And that is often or very often, 1 point. Okay, question 15, talking too much in social situations, often or very often. I thought that was interesting wording. How often do you find yourself talking too much? So it's that, wow, ooh, gosh, I was talking too much. Question 16, finishing other people's sentences. Charming, isn't it? And that's sometimes, often, or very often, 1 point. I catch myself doing that. I hate that. Okay. 17, difficulty waiting your turn in situations where turn taking is required. Often or very often, that's 1 point. And then question 18 about interrupting other people when they're busy. Sometimes, often, or very often is 1 point. So we've done both sections and we've scored them. Yay! Good for you. You pushed through and you got it done. Okay, so part B, we gave a score because those shaded boxes on the quiz, that's where I was saying 1 point, it says there is no total score or diagnostic likelihood for those 12 questions. That means it's not like there's a line. Like for part A, if it's 4 or more, yeah, you probably have it. You want to look into it some more. For part B, it's all about how is it affecting you? Where is your level of impairment or your level of disorder? So those are going to be insight for you and things to discuss with your doctor. Again, stick around. You can always use self-management, life management stuff. It's tools to try. The same tools don't work for everybody, but some tools work for some people. So stick around, get ideas, and you'll have a lot of other options. So I want to tell you a story about an experience that helped me a lot, and kind of gave me a metaphor for dealing with life. When I first got out of college, I was interested in a lot of different activities. I took some dance, I took stage combat, I took martial arts, and one of the classes I took was fencing. My first sparring match with my classmate was a big deal. It was really exciting and really intimidating because even though you have a mask that's protecting your face, even though you trust the mask, having a pointy object coming at you gets your adrenaline going. So we did this bout and I was just trying my best to block and ho ha ha, dodge, parry, turn, right? I really wanted to win. And I just kept focused on, I have to make a hit. I have to make a hit. Every hit is a point. I have to make a hit. Touche, 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 touche. And at the end of the match, my teacher took me aside and he said, that was embarrassing. That was awful. You had no form, you weren't using the right moves, you weren't using the right blocks. You took so many hits that you didn't need to take. I don't even know what half that stuff is you were doing. It wasn't anything I ever taught you. And I felt really bad. And he said, but you won. You got more points. You took a lot of hits, your opponent got a lot of points, but you got more points. So you won. And I think that's very important for those of us with ADHD to remember. We have obstacles coming at us. We can't always do things the straight ahead way. Sometimes we have to dodge and duck and block. But if you just keep focused on what you're trying to accomplish, on your result, on your goal, just touche, 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 touche. At the end of the day, you'll get a lot further. Because at the end of the day, it's not about how perfect your process was or about how you made everything look effortless. You're not a show pony. It's about getting it done, getting the results you want, and accomplishing what you want to accomplish. So I hope that this messy, sloppy process of getting it done was helpful for you. If so, please subscribe, like this video, hit the notification bell so you'll get new content as soon as I put it out. And if you have comments, suggestions, or more questions for me to answer, please leave them in the comments and I will make a video just for you. Thanks. Have a great day.